Hey, good morning. Welcome to our session. I'm very excited to be with you here today and get some perspectives from the industry on sustainability from our panelists. I'm going to go let them introduce themselves. Since you have Mohan or whoever wants to start. Start that way? Okay, Priya.
Hey, everybody. My name is Priya Chhiba. I am the sustainability lead within Google's advanced tech innovation team. So our team designs the upfront data centers for Google. Also, I am a co-lead at the OCP data center facilities sustainability team. And within that team, we run a number of subgroups, one focused on metrics, one focused on water, heat, and energy, and the third one focused on data center construction emissions reduction.
My name is Andrea Desimone. I'm with Schneider Electric. I work in our data center segment on all things sustainability, really working with our customers to be their best partner for sustainability. And the way that that plays out a lot is in trying to make sure that as a supplier we're acting responsibly, we're reducing the embodied carbon of what we sell. I'm also very involved in the iMasons working group for equipment, where we're working to standardize measurement for embodied carbon of the equipment that goes into data centers.
Yeah. Good morning, my name is Mohan Kumar. I lead the cloud and server architecture and sustainability architecture at Intel in the data center group, and I'm also the project lead for sustainability at OCP.
Thank you, everybody. I'm grateful to be here with you. My name is Rob Coyle. I'm the Community Technical Program Manager for the Open Compute Project. And so I have the privilege of being in the room with all these brilliant people who are helping us tackle some of the biggest challenges our industry is seeing around sustainability. And the challenges start company to company, everybody moving in maybe the same direction, maybe in not the same direction. And so they've come together in different organizations to try and find some alignment. Then we also have multiple organizations, and maybe they're not all rowing in the same direction. So part of our discussion is around how the companies are finding ways to row in the same direction towards a better sustainable future, and also the organizations in which they're participating in, like OCP Sustainability Project in the data center facilities, and our top-level project, iMasons Climate Accord, and others. So with those challenges, and Priya, I'll start with you. What are the greatest challenges and opportunities in making data centers and digital infrastructure more sustainable and more eco-friendly? Because if it was easy, we would be solving it already, right?
I'd like to talk about opportunities first, because I see the space bringing a lot of opportunity for us as an industry. So one of the areas that I see that we can really excel in is innovation, because that is ingrained in the way we do things within the data center industry. So there's definitely opportunity for innovation, especially now with AI and ML taking off. There is so much opportunity to leverage that to make the world more sustainable. So I'd like to see what comes out of that as we move forward with our sustainability efforts. The next item that I see is leadership. The data center industry is a leader in a lot of things. We've taken leadership even during the pandemic. So I think that this gives us an opportunity to lead in an area, to develop new skills, and to help pull the other industries with us as well. Part of this is collaboration, so that's the third area that I see as an opportunity. But we do really well at collaborating within this industry. What I'd like for us to do is start looking at industries where we really don't know much about. For instance, the construction industry, when we're looking at green concrete, right? We need to start collaborating with industries that are outside our comfort zone. So how do we collaborate with our contractors? How do we collaborate with the mom and pop businesses that make the concrete mixes that we use to build our data centers? And how do we pull them along in our journey? So that's something that we definitely need to focus on as well. And the last area is partnership. So, we have different organizations within the industry. There's OCP, there's iMasons Climate Accord. What we need to do is we need to partner with each other, make sure we're not overlapping, make sure that we all are not doing the same thing and not recreating the wheel. Let's learn from each other. Let's work together, because together I think we can achieve a lot more.
Thanks, Priya. Andrea, from your perspective and your involvement in iMasons Climate Accord, do you share the same vision? Are those the same top initiatives for you?
Yeah, I think so. And I think one of the things that we're seeing is that we're moving forward on how to measure a lot of these sustainability metrics, helping organizations be more transparent with their sustainability performance. And as Priya said, it's a good opportunity for us to find ways to work together and not overlap, because we can't just keep talking about how we're going to measure the impacts that we have. We have to start moving into action. We have 6 years and a couple months left until 2030. Well, the time is now. So if we're still talking in 6 years in all these segregated ways about how we're going to measure things like embodied carbon or operational emissions, we're not going to actually be moving the needle to where we need to go.
It sounds like we have to find alignment on what those things are first before we take action. Does it feel like we're too afraid to move before we've all agreed?
I don't think that that's necessarily the case. I just think that we're really stuck on finding our baselines, and I think that we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We don't have to wait until we have our baselines. We don't have to wait until we've all figured out the same way to measure the carbon impact of our data centers. We can start taking actions to reduce what we're doing, because once we have that baseline, there's really two big ways that we're going to reduce the carbon impact of what we're putting into data centers. The first is by making choices based on lower carbon impact, and the second is by reducing, on a supplier by supplier basis, how they're performing. And we can start doing those things now. We can start making an effort, particularly in that second point, to say, even if we're not coalesced around in exactly the same way of measuring what our carbon impact is, we can all agree that there's steps to be taken both on a supplier operational level and how they're engaging with their own supply chain to start chipping away at the carbon impact of what we're selling to our data center customers. And we can do that at the same time that we're figuring out how to measure these things.
Excellent, thanks. Mohan, let's fast forward and say, we have those metrics, we have those targets in place, we've come to at least a majority alignment. From your perspective, how does technology play a role, and how do we start moving? How do we start taking action?
Yeah, so there are things that we are doing at an industry as a company that I work for, Intel, and there are things that we are doing at OCP. Let me talk about Intel, and then I'll talk about OCP as well, right? So essentially, being able to measure the amount of carbon impact that you have in the process of manufacturing your silicon, what carbon is there in the platform, providing good metrics on the silicon to measure how much power is being consumed when you run and operationalize your data center. Those are all key things that feed into what technology is going to exist to do this, right? To make this possible. And then coming to the OCP side, as the project lead, we have a bunch of work streams at the sustainability level, and they are focused on carbon modeling, which is to solve the problem of how much carbon are we attributing to a certain piece of hardware, right? Whether it's operational or embodied carbon. And second thing is that do we have good metrics to measure how much power is being consumed in a given platform, right? I always joke that how much power is a platform consuming at any given point is the easiest question with the hardest answer, because it's not that apparent how you go about measuring it readily platform to platform.
Sure.
Right. And the third thing that we have been looking at as metrics that you guys refer to is the metrics. We all need to align not only on metrics, and I think where OCP excels is not just in setting metrics, but having a profile that says, here is the agreement that we are all going to place in place on how we are going to use these metrics. How does this, like for example, PUE, am I going to measure PUE as a 1 year average, 12-month running average? Am I going to take a point in time? Am I going to base it on a certain load on the system? All of these things are the kind of profiles that OCP has always excelled at, and that's the other one that we are looking to. And lastly, one of the things we are looking to open up here is, which we don't talk about as much when you talk about data center, is carbon recapture, right? So we could capture carbon and sink it somewhere. I mean, that's what Mother Nature does.
Sure.
And so to the extent that we release it, we have to have an obligation to see if we can capture it back. And it's a technological problem, and that's the other place we look into it.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, you said two things that jumped out at me. One is when you're in a room full of sustainability professionals, PUE, that's a very loaded acronym, right? There's lots of debate around that. So what are, Andrea, if you wouldn't mind chiming in, what metrics really are important? How does deciding what metrics we're using, and how does transparency in how we came to those choices impact how we move forward?
Sure. So I know that there's a group, Priya, you were involved in this too, for measuring the types of metrics that we should be tracking. They really span across energy, carbon, water, waste, and biodiversity. And pulling those out, these aren't new metrics that this group has invented from whole cloth. These are ISO metrics. They're standards that we've all agreed on that are sound and verifiable. Pulling out salient ones, we need to, I think the three big things that I see as really important are energy, carbon, and water. When we think about water, we want to look at water on site and water that's being used in energy production as well. Those are things that impact a fairly local community, no matter what. With carbon, I'm always going to harp on embodied carbon because I think it's a big white whale. I think we have pretty sound ways of measuring our Scope 2 emissions and our Scope 1 emissions, but I think it's really important for every data center operator to get a really good handle on what their Scope 3 emissions are as well, because when a data center is first built, on average in the US, 70% of the emissions are in that embodied carbon. At year 15, it's still up to I think 39% or something. So,
wow.
It's embodied carbon is a big issue, and as data center operators are moving more and more to renewable energy, their Scope 2 is going down anyway. So the Scope 3 is increasingly being a bigger part of the pie throughout the entire life cycle of the data center.
Yeah, as you start tackling those Scope 2 issues, then now it's a greater percentage of your impact, right?
Right.
Is that from a transparency perspective, and Mohan, you touched on it, but I want to ask Andrea first, is that where people don't feel comfortable around PUE? It's not transparent. We don't know what that PUE numbers, like we see it in marketing. We say, oh, our PUE is X. Well, when, where, right? Those are the pieces missing. How does transparency in what we measure going forward, is that important?
And I don't have a big opinion on PUE.
Sure.
Might be maybe the only one in the room. But I think transparency is important going forward. If we're going to measure things, we need to baseline against, be consistent with how we're measuring them, how we're reporting them, so that our data center customers, so that our stakeholders in general can have a really good view of performance over time, whether that's PUE, whether that's carbon, whether it's water or waste.
Okay, great. Yeah, go ahead, Priya.
To add to that too, I think that's where organizations like OCP and iMasons Climate Accord come into play, because within these organizations we can provide the guidelines. Like Mohan was alluding to, how do you report out on PUE? Is it a point in time or is it over a period of time? And what is that period? What is appropriate for that period? So I think we as OCP and iMasons should come up with some sort of guidelines for the industry so that we can all be consistent. And then when we're comparing across the board, then we're comparing apples to apples, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of work to be done in this area.
Sure.
And we're looking for people to join us to help us achieve this goal.
Yeah, that's a call to action for anybody who can hear us. Like if you're in this audience and you're not already involved in a sustainability project, either with OCP or iMasons or other organizations, get involved. Obviously, you're here because you have interest. The next step is getting involved.
Yeah. And Rob, the transparency aspect, I think, is really important, because I think we should be leveraging lessons learned from each other.
Sure.
Within the industry. So, if we come out and say, hey, 1.0 PUE is achievable and someone's managed to achieve that, then we should be sharing that information on how that is achieved as an industry so that, we can pull the rest of the industry along with us.
Yeah.
Someone's managed to achieve a 60% reduction in greenhouse gas in concrete. We should be sharing that.
Yeah.
So that we can enable the industry, but then by our interaction in the industry, we'll be affecting the broader community as well.
Is that a key area? Mohan touched on it around carbon capture, but I'll stay with you, Priya, just for 1 second. Is, concrete, what are areas of technology? Like, okay, once we share how we move forward, like, what are the promising areas where we might be able to make progress?
So concrete's one of them. The other one is energy, greening up our energy. So, renewables are not baseload power. And as we transition more and more to renewables, we are becoming challenged with maintaining that baseload power, and we need to start looking at new technologies out there. They could be geothermal, they could be hydroelectric. Those are from renewable baseload, but then also as an industry, maybe we should start considering something like nuclear power. I know that came up as a topic in our discussion within the Data Center Facility Sustainability Group a few weeks back. And, it may be 5 or 10 years out, but, as an industry, if we start showing interest in nuclear, is there any way we can accelerate that timeline?
Yeah.
Not sure what your views are on that.
Hey, Mohan, since you brought up carbon capture as one of them, and then Priya, you just mentioned nuclear, right? Because if we're going to do carbon capture, that takes energy, right? What other areas, what stands in our way from deploying that, those next steps?
Well, one is, we don't have the technologies at scale to do these things. And also, it needs to be co-located with where you have these problems, right? So, and that's not the case today, right? So for example, you could do carbon capture. As you rightly point out, carbon capture itself takes energy.
Right.
But you don't want that. So what we are exploring in OCP is using the data center's exit heat to do the carbon capture. Because if you're going to spend more energy, you only add it to the problem.
Right.
Right? You didn't really solve the problem. So these synergies need to exist, and that's when it becomes interesting. It's a technological issue. I'm a technologist, right, by profession. So we look at these things as the opportunities on where we want to go. How do we do the carbon capture right next to where all the heat sources are. And it's not the only way, right? So we've also looked, there is many data centers where, especially in Europe, where they essentially take the rejected heat from the data center and use it they have a district heating in many of the Scandinavian countries. They just pump it into the district heating circuit. So instead of so they actually make money off their heat, which is like, hats off to them, right?
Right.
And in Middle America, where it tends to be colder in the northern latitudes, those data centers essentially are pumping that heat into a greenhouse so as to grow vegetables and whatever in greenhouses, because that does two things. Now you're locally sourcing them, and two, you're no longer transporting them from some far-off place in the country to get it over there, thereby saving the overall carbon footprint of the entire nation.
Yeah, we actually have an OCP-ready data center in Canada, Q-Scale, and they're using heat, and they're using heat for growing vegetable in a grow house.
Exactly.
And there's others with plans, to do similar things. I think it's what's most changed that I've seen just over the last couple of years, and maybe the more northern countries and areas have always thought of heat as energy, but we've always thought of heat of this thing we got to get rid of.
As a pain that we have to deal with.
Yeah.
Right. As proof is when you go on top of this building, it gets rejected up into the atmosphere.
Right.
But if you just change your mindset into, is this an opportunity for me to do something with it? And that's really there's a lot of technologies. I can go on.
Yeah, I bet.
There are.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I wanted to add something to what Mohan said. The technologies are here, we just need them at scale. And a lot of the technologies like waste heat reuse or the actual technology is not rocket science, right? It's something that's basic heat exchange and piping, right? But what's stopping us from adopting the technology. So the DUE recently came up with something. So they have the TRL, which is a technology readiness level, that tells you, what level of technology the technology is ready for commercialization. And essentially, if it's commercialized, then it gets a high TRL score. But they came up with an adoption readiness level. And there's various challenges to adopting a technology. And I think that's what we need to focus on is, for instance, waste heat reuse has been around for years. What's stopping us from adopting it, right? There's various challenges, and we're all aware of it. One of the biggest one is there's no return on investment, or the return on investment is really hard to define, right? Unless, as Mohan mentioned, you're in the Scandinavian countries and you can recoup something for that. So that is one of the challenges, right? The other challenge is finding a suitable partner to offtake that waste heat, right? The other challenge is data center waste heat is low-grade heat. So how do we ramp it up? So I think what we need to start focusing on is what's stopping us from adopting some of these technologies. And there's a bunch of green technologies out there. There's HVO, there's green concrete. But there's also challenges to adopting it, and maybe that's what we need to focus on next with an OCP is how can we start adopting it, and how can we start accelerating the industry to adopting the technology.
Yeah, and possibly using things that already exist, right, instead of creating new things. Andrea, we've talked, there's challenges around scope 3, right? So we're going to create new technologies, we're going to bring more things to the data center. Maybe we're building things that capture carbon, but how does scope 3, as we decide how we move forward to reduce energy consumption and reduce carbon in other ways, the things we build, right, are our biggest offenders now. So, what's important about, what should we be thinking about around scope 3?
I think in terms of scope, it's improving upon it is what we should be thinking. And I don't know if this actually answers this question, but something that you just said made me think of a presentation we were listening to yesterday about more low carbon concrete. And I think that the key too is that the presenter was talking about is the customers need to spec, not preclude low carbon solutions in their specs. And when it comes to concrete, that seemed to be a really big issue. Concrete's a little outside of where I work personally, but it's I think when we think about scope 3, it's getting an understanding about where we are on both an individual equipment level and then the entire architecture of the data center, and then again having that sight line to how those numbers are going to be reduced. Even if we don't have a sound baseline today, what are the actions that are being taken by the supplier in their own operations, in product design, and in the supply chain that are going to have measurable results in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years.
Yeah, go ahead. Priya wants to add to that.
Add to that?
Yeah.
So there's multiple levers with scope 3 emissions reduction, right? The first one is, and within our control as data center designers, owners, operators, is design related. So, we've standardized our designs, and part of that standardization results in us building the same facility multiple times in multiple locations. So we could be building a seismic D structure in an area that only requires seismic B, Class B requirements, resulting in our concrete and steel being over-designed. That is totally within our control. So the first step we can take is optimizing our designs.
Yeah, just use less, right?
Just use less, right? And that goes with steel, concrete, and those are some of the biggest contributors to our greenhouse gas emissions within our data centers. The other things we can look at is potentially modularization, right? And then figuring out how to densify as well, because the smaller physical footprint we occupy, the more carbon or greenhouse gas friendly we become. So, those are just a few things, and based on the levers that I've seen, like just us as an industry can have like a 20% reduction in our greenhouse gas emissions as a result. Then we get to our supply chain and the processes used to create the products that we buy that contribute to the rest of the greenhouse gas emissions.
Yeah, it sounds like a great first step.
Can I ask a question about that too? Because one of the things that we saw in the last few years is that supply chain constraints forced a lot of our customers who otherwise had repeatable architectures that they stuck to no matter where they were building to make changes because of being able to get the supply. Can't we apply that same kind of flexibility to sustainability as well? I think that there's like really big lessons to be learned there.
Definitely agree.
Yeah.
Is that, Mohan, do you have thoughts? Like, is it, we did it for supply chain, right? It was, as you called out, like, we don't have fan motors. Well, we're going to have to use less fan motors then, right? But the motivation was supply, not we have targets that we need to plant in the ground and drive towards. 6.5 years left, right? Mohan, do you have additional thoughts on that?
On scope 3 or?
Yeah.
Okay, I mean, scope 3 is a very challenging problem, right? So to me, industry as a whole needs to solve scope 1 and scope 2 really, really well, because in scope 3, there is, scope 3 is essentially what the people that you depend on, and then the customers you sell into, and what happens to the end of life of the product, right? The upstream scope 3, I think you can quantify it. Downstream scope 3 is very, very hard to quantify because, especially if you have things that are going into somebody's hands and somebody has a policy, you don't get to dictate to your customer what that policy is going to be. So I think this is where maybe this is regulatory in some sense on, hey, you're not going to, how you recycle your motherboard. Maybe part of a regulatory thing that says this is how it gets recycled, or you reclaim that part and reuse it. It's truly going to be solved by a partnership on the downstream scope 3. Upstream scope 3 is a lot easier to handle because you know exactly who you're buying from, and you can go ask them for, can I have your carbon impact statement? But you can't do that with downstream as easily.
Is not being able to control downstream, is that why we've seen things like cycle times being extended? Like, I can control it if I'm still holding on to it, right? We're going from 3 to 5 years maybe on some things.
No, I think there is lots of reasons why folks do that. I don't know if it's exactly because of the recycle, but I mean, even in OCP, there are folks, it has spawned an industry at this point, right? There are companies that exist whose job is to take the older hardware from one vendor and then, sell it through to the other person after refurbishing. So it lives on in a different way, so it extends the life. But I'm talking about, so that's great, but eventually, it does have a finite lifetime. It's silicon, eventually there is a lifetime to anything that we humans do, right? What happens to it at that point is something that is not one company or even a one organization problem. It's everybody's problem to go solve that, right?
Yeah, I completely agree. And is that what has brought these individual organizations to things like OCP sustainability, iMasons Climate Accord, things like that? And how do we start pulling that together? How do we leverage those organizations to start getting us towards those targets?
I think this is, first step is to essentially be able to quantify what those are, right? You cannot fix anything you cannot measure. And right now we have a problem of, we cannot measure it. Because once it's out of your hands, and I'm not speaking for anyone particular, it's
Sure.
probably universally true. Once it's out of your hand as a manufacturer or a supplier or right, you don't know what happens at the other end fully, right? And in order to get there has to be some tracking body that says, this is what happened. And then now you have a number, and then you can put this is how I'm going to go recycle this. This is how I'm going to reuse parts of it, right? And then the other issue is we can solve this at the root by saying, I'm going to use things that are better to the environment from the get-go, right?
Sure.
So my embodied carbon footprint already is less. The number of chemicals that I'm going to use to make this is already reduced. I'm going to use ocean recycled plastic, for example. So there are things that we could do to fix the problem at the source. And to me, I would start there,
Right.
while we work on coming up with how we measure what's at the downstream, and then
improve what you can control first, right?
What you can control.
So with your experience, Andrea, in iMasons Climate Accord, which you mentioned, how can we better work together with outside organizations outside of OCP? How do we find alignment?
Right. I think that's a great question. And I think one thing we've maybe mentioned on this stage already is not duplicating efforts, really coming together and realizing a lot of us same people are working in both organizations and across the industry. One of the things that the iMasons Climate Accord is doing is we're putting forth case studies to be evaluated by the governing body about how to coalesce around the same way across the board to measure embodied carbon of equipment. In the case of what I'm working with, same thing for both energy and materials. I think it would be important for within OCP to recognize the work that's being done, not try to duplicate it, and adopt it as an OCP practice as well.
Fantastic. Priya, your perspective on the same question?
Yeah, I agree with Andrea. I think, definitely let's not duplicate efforts. Let's figure out who's doing what and work together. OCP produces a lot of guidelines, checklists, documents, white papers, and we could definitely leverage the work that iMasons has been doing through their case studies, and then together publish OCP papers, guidelines, standardized guidance for the industry, so that we as an industry can align for what we're asking for. The worst that could happen is different players in the industry go out to our suppliers and say, hey, I want it this way, or I want it that way. And that just creates confusion, and it's going to delay progress. So the faster we align and put out a consistent message, I think the faster we can start measuring and improving.
And then from there, if we can align internally inside our industry, you mentioned earlier reaching out even to, outside our industry, further up the supply chain or even downstream, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that can definitely have an influence beyond just the data center industry.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much. Those are kind of my final questions, but I want to give you opportunity. Any final thoughts or something that we didn't touch on, or something you want to highlight? Today, the rest of the day, the sustainability track moves on. They're not here. They're in a track. So definitely want you to follow us there after we leave here. But yeah, any other thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. Please go in and join the sustainability track. There's a lot of interesting discussions. I think we'll be touching on direct air capture, and there'll be some fun panel discussions as well. And then also, please join, once again, our sustainability team meetings. We have 4 different meetings within data center facilities sustainability, and then I think the broader sustainability initiative has a few meetings set up as well. Mohan can probably, 4 of them as well, yeah. So please join any one of those. Something that we've been talking about is potentially starting a supply chain track on the facility side, and we need to be consistent on the messaging we send out to our suppliers as well. So look out for that. That may be coming up as one of another work stream within sustainability.
And I would just say the same thing for iMasons. We're looking for people with knowledge of energy and carbon in equipment and operations and materials to help us progress the work that we're doing.
Yeah. First of all, yeah, definitely will. Thank you for coming, and thanks. I encourage you to come join sustainability project and work with us. I want to leave you with this parting thoughts. I'm a technologist and a numbers guy. So if the data centers were a country, they would be in the top 15 consumers of electricity in the world, right? So that's not a small number, right? So the data centers consume way more power than the state of California does. And we are scheduled to add about 18 gigawatts of power to the North American data centers alone in the next 4 years. That's a lot of power that's being added. Actually, by 2030, I should say. So that's a lot of power, and we need to be responsible in the way that power is going to be impacting all of us in the world, right? And this is where sustainability is such an important initiative, and so I cannot thank you enough for, first of all, coming here, and please come work with all of us to make it better.
Well, thanks, folks. You have the invitation. It's been extended. I'd like to thank my panelists for sharing their perspectives on the industry and how we move forward in sustainability. And please join us, and thanks to our audience. And hopefully we'll see you on the engineering track.